Can a person find true happiness without wealth, power, or luxury? What if real pleasure lies in simplicity rather than extravagance? Could a piece of bread, a jug of water, and a little cheese be enough for happiness? How can we overcome the fear of gods and death and live in peace? More than 2,000 years ago, a philosopher dared to answer these questions. This is the story of Epicurus, the ancient Greek thinker who devoted his life to the pursuit of true happiness and the liberation of mankind from unnecessary fears. Epicurus was one of the most influential philosophers of the Hellenistic era, a man whose name is still the subject of debate today, often misunderstood and oversimplified. He was born in 341 BCE on the island of Samos in an Athenian colony to modest parents, Neocles and Cheristrata. His father was a teacher, and his mother took part in religious rituals, traveling and performing divinations. Although they did not belong to the higher social classes, they provided their son with an education that set him on the path of philosophy. Epicurus himself became interested in philosophical questions at an early age, and, according to tradition, at the age of only 14, he began pondering the foundations of the world when his teacher asked him whether everything arises from chaos, which spurred him to search for his own answers. In his youth, he was educated in a tradition that included both Platonism and Demarchitan atomism, and throughout his life he encountered different schools of thought. He was especially shaped by the ideas of Democritus, who founded the atomistic theory of the universe. Epicurus adopted atomism, but gave it a completely different meaning, not as a dry, materialistic picture of the cosmos, but as a basis for freeing the human mind from the fear of gods and death. Even then, he laid the foundation of his philosophy. Human well-being does not depend on the power of gods or the whims of fate, but on inner balance, tranquility, and the ability to live a rational and moderate life. Around 306 BCE, Epicurus settled in Athens and founded his school, which soon became known as the Garden. Unlike Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum, Epicurus's garden was not a place reserved only for free men of higher classes. He opened the doors of his school to women and slaves, which was completely revolutionary in Greece at the time. Philosophy, he believed, was meant for anyone who wished to live a happy and peaceful life. This inclusivity brought him both sympathy and hostility, but it also ensured the spread of his ideas beyond the narrow confines of elite education. The very appearance of the garden carried symbolic value. It was literally a garden with plants, shady paths, and resting places where students gathered to discuss life and philosophy. Epicurus did not think that philosophy should be an abstract occupation with metaphysical concepts, but rather a practical tool for achieving happiness. He said that philosophy is useless if it does not heal the soul, comparing its role to medicine that heals the body. His famous thought was that one should pursue philosophy both in youth and in old age, because it is never too early or too late to seek happiness. The central point of Epicurus's philosophy was the idea that nature consists of atoms and void, and all phenomena in the world can be explained by their motion and collisions. Yet he introduced an original element into this theory, the idea of the swerve of atoms, meant to explain the possibility of free will. If atoms moved only in straight lines and collided necessarily, everything would be predetermined, and human freedom would be an illusion. But thanks to small, unpredictable deviations in their motion, there was room for human freedom and spontaneous choice. In this way, He reconciled materialistic physics with the experience of freedom that everyone feels. Epicurus was also a thinker of ethics par excellence. His ethical system rested on the idea that happiness is the goal of human life, but not in the sense of unrestrained pleasures, as he was often wrongly accused, but in the sense of lasting peace of mind, ataraxia, and absence of bodily pain, aponia. In his vision, true happiness was not in the endless accumulation of desires, but in their wise limitation. He divided desires into natural and necessary, natural but not necessary, and empty and useless. Food, water, and shelter were necessary desires. A lavish feast was natural but not necessary, while power, fame, and unlimited wealth were empty desires that brought restlessness and dissatisfaction. Epicurus said that a man content with bread, water, and a little cheese could be as happy as a king on his throne. Particularly significant was his teaching on death. Epicurus believed that the fear of death was the greatest obstacle to human happiness. Death, he said, is nothing to us, for when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we no longer exist. In other words, death is not an experience that any of us can undergo, so there is no reason to fear it. In this way, he freed his students from one of the deepest and most universal human anxieties. He also held that the gods exist, but that they live in perfect peace and bliss and do not interfere in human affairs, so there is no reason to fear divine punishment. Epicurus's philosophy quickly gained many followers, but also sharp opponents. The Stoics considered him too attached to pleasures, while the Platonists criticized him for his materialism. In the Middle Ages, especially under the influence of Christian theology, his name became a synonym for hedonism and debauchery, although his teaching was quite the opposite. Only in the modern era were his texts rehabilitated, inspiring many thinkers, from Montaigne to Hume, and contemporary philosophers of secularism. One of the most interesting aspects of Epicurus's life was his personal consistency. He was not a philosopher who preached one thing and lived another. On the contrary, testimonies state that he lived extremely modestly, content with meager meals and simple conversations with friends. His famous line was, "Send me a little cheese, so that, when I wish, I may feast." This showed that pleasure does not depend on luxury, but on the ability to rejoice in small things. His health was not the best. He suffered from various illnesses, but until the very end of his life, he remained cheerful and calm, which, according to his students, was the best proof of the truth of his philosophy. He died in 270 BCE in Athens, around students and friends, allegedly leaving a message in which he said that although he suffered bodily pains, in his thoughts he felt joy from conversations and memories of companionship. Epicurus wrote about 300 books, but most have been lost. Only fragments and a few preserved letters remain, among which the letter to Herodotus, the letter to Paicocles, and the letter to Menesi stand out. In them, he presented his main ideas on nature, gods, death, and happiness. In addition to the letters, the principal doctrines have been preserved, a collection of 40 short maxims that summarized his teaching. These sayings were often copied and memorized, as they offered simple and practical advice for everyday life. His students continued spreading his thought after his death. The Epicurean school survived for several centuries and had supporters throughout the Hellenistic world and in Rome. The most famous Roman Epicurean was the poet Lucretius, author of On the Nature of Things, in which he presented Epicurean physics and ethics in verse. Lucretius conveyed the spirit of Epicurus's philosophy in Latin and secured its survival in cultural tradition,
even though it was later suppressed with the rise of Christianity. Epicurus also left behind many interesting anecdotes still retold today. His garden was the first philosophical space to bear a name that evoked nature and friendship, rather than an abstract institution. There was even a kind of Epicurean fellowship, where friends ate, conversed, and lived together in community. For Epicurus, friendship was one of the greatest sources of happiness. He believed that without friends, no one could truly be happy. In this sense, his teaching was not merely individualistic, but emphasized the importance of communal life and mutual support. Epicurus's legacy, though greatly damaged by the loss of most of his writings, nevertheless retained its power through fragments and testimonies of other philosophers, shaping European thought for centuries.
His students and later followers were not only philosophers in the strict sense, but also ordinary people who found practical value for daily life in his teaching. His garden, unlike the closed schools of other philosophers, was a place where people talked about illness, friendship, death, joys, and hardships of ordinary life. It was precisely this practical dimension of philosophy that ensured his name would survive and be passed down from generation to generation, even if often distorted. One of the key features of Epicurus's teaching was his ability to remove fear, for he believed that fears of death, of gods, of natural forces, and even of other people stand in the way of happiness. His rational approach to nature served to show that lightning, earthquakes, and eclipses were not the work of capricious gods, but natural phenomena with causes of their own. In this way, he freed people from anxiety and superstition. He did not aim to build science in the modern sense, but he believed that knowledge of the basic structure of the world, even in broad strokes, had a therapeutic effect. If a person knows that everything arises from atoms and void, and that no supernatural threats lurk behind every corner, he can calm down and focus on his own life. His view of the gods was particularly provocative in antiquity. He did not deny their existence, he believed they were real, but he held that they were perfectly blissful and therefore uninterested in human affairs. This meant that prayers, sacrifices, and rituals could not alter the course of the world, since the gods did not intervene in human lives. Such an outlook made his philosophy one of the first secular systems of thought because it freed space from man and his own responsibility. That is precisely why later religious thinkers accused him of impiety, even though he was not an atheist in the modern sense, but rather a philosopher who removed the gods from everyday human life. From an ethical standpoint, Epicurus developed a very refined system. He believed that all people naturally seek pleasure and avoid pain, but that many err in thinking this means unrestrained indulgence. His hedonism was moderate and rational. He emphasized that one must distinguish between fleeting pleasures that bring more pain than benefit and modest yet lasting pleasures that secure tranquility. Overeating, drunkenness, or unbridled passions lead to suffering later, while modest nourishment, healthy conversation, and friendship provide stable satisfaction. It was precisely at this point that frequent misunderstandings arose. Many of his opponents accused him of debauchery, whereas he actually advocated self-discipline and the wise management of desires. True happiness, he argued, lies in liberation from unnecessary cravings. Epicurus always stressed the value of friendship in his teaching. In the letters and fragments that survive, he repeats that without friends, there can be no true happiness, for friends not only bring joy, but also security and support in difficult times. The garden was conceived as a community of friends, not as a rigid school. This was reflected in his way of life. Meals were shared, conversations were open, and hierarchy was minimal.
In this way, Epicurus introduced into philosophy an element of fellowship that was often neglected in other traditions, where the emphasis lay on the individual mind and personal development. Another interesting aspect of Epicurus is that despite his materialism, he attached great importance to peace of mind and inner harmony. His philosophy can be viewed as a form of therapy. He believed that just as a doctor heals the body, so the philosopher should heal the soul. His four principal teachings, known as the tetrapharmakos, served as a kind of prescription for a happy life. One should not fear the gods. One should not fear death. Good is easy to obtain, and evil is easy to endure. In these simple maxims lay an entire strategy for freeing oneself from anxiety and attaining serenity. Epicurus's conception of freedom was also original. He introduced the idea that atoms, although they mostly move by necessity, sometimes spontaneously deviate from their path. This tiny, random clinomen made possible the existence of free decisions in the world. In this way, although he was a materialist, he did not accept complete determinism. Human choices were not predetermined by mechanical laws. There was room for freedom in them. This was one of the earliest attempts in philosophy to reconcile natural laws with human free will, a theme that still preoccupies philosophers today. Although respected among his disciples during his lifetime, he was simultaneously the target of numerous attacks. His opponents spread rumors that he lived a dissolute life, indulging in luxury and unrestrained passions. Yet sources close to his school say quite the opposite, that he was modest, lived almost ascetically, and was content with the bare essentials. His modesty and consistency stood in stark contrast to the caricature drawn by his opponents. Ironically, it was this distortion of his philosophy that survived for a long time through history. In the Middle Ages and early modern period, Epicurean became synonymous with libertine, even though his was among the most moderate philosophical teachings. Nevertheless, Epicureanism had a great influence, especially in Rome. The poet Lucretius, in his work On the Nature of Things, transmitted the Epicurean vision of the cosmos and man into Latin and made it accessible to Roman culture. His verses on atoms, on death, and on liberation from fear resonated for centuries. Later, during the Renaissance, this work was rediscovered and had an enormous impact on the development of modern science and philosophy. Many who read Lucretius also came to know Epicurus. His philosophy became an inspiration for scientists such as Galileo and Gassendi, and even for Enlightenment thinkers like Diderot and Voltaire. It is noteworthy that Epicurean ideas about nature and freedom aligned with the scientific worldview emerging in the modern era. Atomism had been forgotten during the Middle Ages, but thanks to Epicurus and Lucretius, it was revived in the science of the 17th century. The idea that the world is composed of tiny particles moving in empty space became the basis of modern natural explanation. Although Epicurus's atomism was crude and imperfect compared to today's knowledge, his philosophical boldness paved the way for modern science.
Beyond science, Epicurus's thought strongly influenced ethics and the philosophy of everyday life. His demand to simplify life, limit desires, and seek joy in friendship and moderation still resonates today. In a time of excessive consumption and constant craving for more, his words sound strikingly contemporary. He showed that happiness is not in what we accumulate, but in what we are able to appreciate. In that sense, his philosophy can serve as a remedy for the modern individual, just as it did for his students more than 2,000 years ago. Of particular importance was Epicurus's attitude toward knowledge and philosophy. While other philosophers often strove for abstract debates and speculations about infinite worlds of ideas, he reduced philosophy to what was useful for human life. His philosophy was worldly,
in the best sense of the word. It dealt with questions of how to free oneself from fear, how to live modestly, how to find joy in life regardless of its hardships. He did not deny the value of speculation, but considered it useless if it did not contribute to peace of mind. For this reason, he remained one of the most practical and life-oriented philosophers of antiquity. His death, described in testimonies left by his students, was in harmony with his teaching. He is said to have suffered from painful kidney stones, but in his final moments he wrote to his friends that although he endured physical pain, his mind was filled with happiness thanks to philosophical conversations and memories of friendships that he had cherished. His peaceful end was proof that his philosophy was not mere theory, but a real way of life. Teachers are often judged by how they lived and how they died. And Epicurus, through both his life and his death, showed a consistency rarely seen in the history of philosophy. Epicurus's legacy, though often contested, still lives on today. His thought lies at the root of modern secularism, the scientific worldview, and a philosophy concerned with human well-being. His name is still used in popular culture, sometimes in misleading ways. The word Epicurean today, in some languages, denotes a lover of fine food and pleasures. But if we return to his true teaching, we see that he was a philosopher of modesty, friendship, and inner peace. His message, that it is enough to have little, that one should not fear either death or the gods, that happiness lies in a simple life, remains universal. It is interesting that Epicurus anticipated with his teaching many ideas that today belong to psychology and ethics. His distinction between desires can be compared to modern theories of motivation. His teaching on death can be related to existentialism and therapeutic approaches to overcoming anxiety. Even his emphasis on friendship and community resonates with today's research on the importance of social bonds for mental health. For this reason, his teaching cannot be seen merely as a relic of antiquity, but as a living source of inspiration. When we bring together all aspects of his life and philosophy, we are presented with the image of a man who lived simply, thought deeply, and taught others that the greatest wealth is a tranquil spirit. His garden was not only a school, but a refuge for all who sought peace. His words were not abstract notions, but advice for life. His figure, though often portrayed as controversial, was in truth the embodiment of consistency. And perhaps this is his greatest strength. He showed that philosophy can be an art of living, not merely an exercise of thought. Epicurus thus remained a symbol of one of the most beautiful and practical messages of philosophy, that happiness is not found in wealth, fame, or power, but in inner peace, in friendship, and in the ability to live simply and without fear. It is a message as important today as it was more than 2,000 years ago, and that is why his name still deserves to stand among the greatest in the history of human thought.